okay? And this WBC just stands for white blood cells. So we have two main types of leukocytes. We have granulocytes and we have agranulocytes. Okay. Now, very simply, the granulocytes contain cytoplasmic granules. Whereas the agranulocytes have no cytoplasmic granules. Okay, so let's describe the granulocytes first. The first one is neutrophils. Then we got eosinophils. And then we got basophils. Okay, all right. So let's draw sort of the structure of these. Now, all of these cells, the granulocytes are pretty unique in their individual types of response that I'll talk about later on, but they all have this bilobed nucleus. Okay, so they have this bilobed shaped nucleus, and they all have granules, right? These cytoplasmic granules. So the cytoplasmic granules are usually toxic substances that help these cells to attack or to destroy pathogens or invaders, okay? Now, what kind of sets them apart is the color of their granules, the way that they stain histologically. So I'll just point that out. The neutrophils have both red and blue staining granules. Right? The eosinophils have mainly red, sometimes called pink, staining granules. And then basophils have blue staining granules. Okay. And this is how we differentiate them in terms of a histologic view of these cells in the blood. Okay, so both pink and blue granules, mainly pink or red granules, and then mainly blue granules. All right, now the monocytes are a type of agranulocyte. And these are the largest cells in our leukocytes. These have a large kind of bean-shaped nucleus. All right, so I'll put here that these are the largest. White blood cell. Okay. And these can then differentiate into our macrophages. Okay. And then we also have lymphocytes, which are part of the agranulocytes as well. And what kind of sets lymphocytes apart is that they have a large nucleus that takes up most of the cell. Okay. All right, so let's kind of describe these here. So these are all granulocytes. These have cytotoxic or cytoplasmic granules in their cell cytoplasm. But we also have another feature that's really important here. So neutrophils and eosinophils have phagocytic abilities. These are phagocytes. So does our macrophage and monocytes. Okay, so it's really important to distinguish which cells have granules, right? Neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, and which do not, monocytes, macrophages, and lymphocytes. I'll talk about in a minute. This is sort of an exception. And then which cells have the ability to phagocytose, macrophages, monocytes, eosinophils, and neutrophils. Now, lymphocytes is sort of an exception because they do have the ability to differentiate into cells that can acquire granules. All right, I don't want you guys to be confused. So lymphocytes can eventually differentiate into another type of cell, which can then eventually acquire granules. But for the most part, T cells, B cells do not have granules, okay? All right, okay. Any questions there about? Any questions? Okay, so we're gonna move on to kind of describe these in a little bit more detail in terms of their function, but I just want you to have an idea of their structure. Okay, so based upon the classification that we already spoke about, we have granulocytes and agranulocytes, and we'll talk about the individual properties of each of these cells. But collectively, the cells that have these cytoplasmic granules are very intimately involved in attacking invaders because of the toxicity of those granules. Whereas a granulocyte, such as monocytes and lymphocytes, are usually involved in another way in the immune response. They're usually involved in cell tagging and other types of identification and destruction of pathogens. Okay. Now this table kind of nicely summarizes what we're going to speak about now, so it's a really good study source. And I do want to kind of draw your attention to the relative concentrations, the relative numbers. Oops. We okay? The relative numbers here of these cells. Not for you to memorize this, right? Don't focus on memorizing any of this, but just for some context, right? So the erythrocytes make up the majority of the cells in blood, and then they're followed by the platelets, which we'll speak about in terms of blood clotting.